start off by doing an acknowledgement to country. In the spirit of reconciliation, My Security Media acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So welcome to this session. This is actually our fourth A City session of the week. We kicked things off on Monday with national space capabilities. We had AI and space robotics on Wednesday. We had net zero spaceflight on Wednesday as well. And today we've got NextGen space with ANU. So really, really exciting. I want to say a huge thank you to our sponsors today. Our platinum sponsor, Inmarsat, thank you. Our gold sponsor, Fugro Spark. Our Women in Space sponsor, Lockheed Martin, and our official media channel, Space and Defense. So first of all, I wanted to acknowledge we've actually had a speaker change. We've got the wonderful Dr. Philippa Ryan joining us today instead of Dr. Cassandra Steer. So hence why she's got the square image there, but she told me to rest assured that she is quite a square person, so apparently it fits in well. So we've got a really great lineup here today. We've got Marta, who's the mission specialist at ANU Institute for Space, and she's also the director of the ANU Bushfire Initiative. We've got Dr. Philippa Ryan, who's a barrister and associate professor at the ANU College of Law. We've got Dr. Frances Bennet, who's a mission specialist at ANU Institute for Space. And we've got the amazing Catherine Ball, who's going to be moderating today's session. She's an associate professor of practice at the Australian National University. So I'm going to ask if all of our speakers could actually join me now on camera. Welcome. And Catherine, I'm going to hand over to you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
There we go. Thank you so much, Jessica, and hello to all of our wonderful attendees. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm dialing in from, which is Gubbi Gubbi land, just north of Brisbane, here on beautiful Moreton Bay. And the area around here has been known as a place for innovation and conversation for thousands of generations. So what better place for me to be dialing in if I can't be in the ACT is to be in beautiful Moreton Bay here on Gubbi Gubbi land. Now, one of the things in terms of housekeeping for today's session is, yes, we have three amazing speakers, and I could quite frankly, each one of them, I would easily listen to for hours on end about how it is they're working and some of the opportunities that we have coming out of ANU and out of Australia in terms of space and to infinity and beyond. But this is not my space to ask them questions. This is your space to ask them questions. So in your Zoom window, you should have a Q&A opportunity button. Now, feel free to use that opportunity button as often as you like. And towards the end of their micro presentations, we will engage in some chat, and then I'll also happily take people's questions, should they be appropriate, to thread into that conversation. So if you have a burning question, now is the time to start thinking about what it is you might be wanting to know, and then please feel free to go ahead and ask that in the Q&A function. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to keep it very choppy and active today, and I am going to share my screen to my PowerPoint. Let's see how we can make this go wrong this morning. Okay. Here we go. And I say morning because I am an hour behind you here in Queensland. So this is all about NextGen Space, and we are all coming to you from the Australian National University Institute for Space, or InSpace, which quite frankly, if my 12-year-old self knew that I was having anything to do with anything called InSpace, I would just be beside myself and in raptures around this opportunity. And one of the things that I'm proudest of being associated with the ANU is the fact that the university itself, its foundation stones are in looking to the stars and beyond, and its future is definitely in looking in the stars and beyond. And despite being an environmental engineer by training, I recognise that what we've learned on planet Earth and what we're going to learn from how we work in space will actually have direct benefits to our own planet, our beautiful blue marble, as we look forward to other places where human beings might like to set foot. I don't really want to talk about myself. You can find me on social media at Dr. Catherine Ball on pretty much every single social media platform apart from Facebook. So there you go. Feel free to interact with me. Okay, we're going to head to our first excellent person today. Dr. Francis Bennet, Mission Specialist in Space at the ANU, a world-leading optical instrumentation researcher focusing on taking quantum communication from the lab to space reality, enabling a global quantum encrypted communications network. Francis, could you please introduce yourself a little bit to us before you jump into your slides? I'd like to hear a random fact about you, or maybe how you got into looking at the stars in the first place yourself.
Sure, thank you very much. So I'm very fortunate to work at the Research School of Astronomy and Astrophysics at the Mount Stromlo Observatory. It's a great place to work. We have really nice views from our offices, which is a rarity in the day of high rise around town. An interesting random fact, I come from a farming background. I've lived on farms for many years, and I've recently moved, to great shock to my system, into Canberra. So it's very interesting having neighbours closer than 1 kilometre away. Okay, so into my slides. Let's see. So I'm just going to give you a broad overview of why we need laser communications and where it's important. So pretty much all radio frequency communications are regulated. There are licenses, which means there are license fees. Those fees in the end are paid for by the user. So every time you pick up your phone and call someone, it costs. It's because there are license fees associated with that, and companies are making money, which is fine. Laser communications escapes regulation globally, except in Australia. It's quite interesting that Australia is the only country in the world who actually regulate blinking lasers on and off when you shine them between two places. There are a huge number of satellites which are going up at the moment. There are mega constellations under construction. You've got SpaceX, the leader. You've got Amazon, a bunch of other places looking to build out global communication networks. There are many good reasons for doing this. Laser communications is going to be part of those networks. While the first SpaceX satellites don't really talk to each other, if they do, it's via radio frequency communications. The next generation are going to have inter-satellite links, which will be driven by lasers. You don't really want laser terminals on everyone's roofs, so those will still be radio frequency, but you do need more high bandwidth connections to centralized locations so that your internet connection goes somewhere that's connected by fiber. And those can be achieved with lasers themselves. Lasers have really great properties, which means you can include more advanced technology, such as quantum communication. So at ANU, we have a few applications we're doing with laser communications at the moment. We are looking at doing a high data rate to satellites, including lunar missions and deep space probes. We are leading the development of the Australasian Optical Ground Station Network in collaboration with a few partners across Australia and New Zealand. Having a network of optical ground stations allows you to provide increased capacity and redundancy against things like cloud interruption. We can also interlink with other international networks being developed. As I mentioned, we can also include quantum encryption and communication. You can envisage having a global quantum encrypted communication network. This can really only be achieved with laser communications through space. It's not really feasible any other way, particularly if you want to have high data rates. So if you want to encrypt your communication and have it ensured encryption, you really need to do it with lasers. Thanks, that's my introduction.
You know, who would have thought lasers would be useful for something like this? Those of us that know little about lasers. Before we move on to Marta and Philippa, Francis, this all sounds amazing, but how is it going? We're like you back on your farm, for example, maybe your farm was in central West Queensland. How is this actually going to directly affect your life and make the way you work better?
Well, I actually had direct line of sight to Mount Stromlo, so my plan was basically to build a lab with a window looking out towards my farm and then set up another lab inside my study looking back and have actual decent internet. Even though I was only about 15 kilometres from the centre of Canberra, I had to rely on satellite NBN, which was fine, but not great, particularly when it rains like it is today. It just stopped working. So I think the way lasers and laser communications are going to help everyday people's lives is going to be through things like the large-scale networks, providing the feeder links for the high data rates that you can expect from these as these networks grow, and also providing a license-free way for that to occur so that it doesn't cost you an arm and a leg.
So people might be thinking here about things like Starlink, because that gets a lot of press. I was recently, just last weekend, doing field work in Cape York, where we only had SATCOM's capability, unless you got up to what they called Signal Mountain, which was actually just the only high ground where you could actually pick up 1 bar of Telstra, I think it was. It didn't help me because I'm on Vodafone, right? So if we look at opportunities around, you know, this idea of digitization of the regions and the smart outback and helping our Indigenous rangers become more digitally enabled, how can you see these advances actually working, and when will they become commonplace?
Yeah, so I think the laser side will have a niche in terms of providing the higher bandwidth feeder links. What people will still carry with them or have on their roofs will still be radio frequency. And so I see that will start to have an impact within the next 5 to 10 years. If you're talking things like quantum communication and more advanced things, that's more like sort of 10 to 20 years down the line, because there's still quite a bit of technology development happening in that space. And to have a widely deployed product, it'll just take a little bit of time.
So if someone's looking at this and thinking, I want to learn more about how I can either invest in this, how can I get involved in the research with this, how can people watching this from industry or even just general people of interest actually get involved with some of this work?
Yeah, so there are a lot of opportunities for people to either be employed in this area, to do I guess, postgraduate study in the area, master's, PhD, and even undergraduate projects. There are a lot of those with research organizations, universities around the country and the world. In terms of investment, there are startups that are coming up. So you can look at either the space side, the optical inter-satellite links. There are multiple startups of that. We're looking at what we can do to commercialize what we're doing on the optical ground station side. So there'll probably be a startup coming out of that in Australia in the future. So there are ways to invest in the fundamental technology. If you're an industry partner who have complementary technology, or you're interested in moving into this area, there are obviously ways you can partner with research organizations to enable, I guess, further funding and leverage what you're able to provide and what the research organization has on offer to be able to grow this area yourself. So you can directly invest that way as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Francis. We'll come back to you for a bit more questioning at the end. I'm just going to share my screen again and move on to our next fabulous speaker, who is Dr. Marta Yebra. Dr. Yebra is a mission specialist with the ANU Institute for Space and the director of the ANU Bushfire Initiative. She works with a team designing Australia's first satellite mission to detect areas with too much dry fire fuel so ground teams can prevent fires from starting. I think back in 2019, 2020, Marta, we thought those bushfires was going to be the worst thing to happen to us in 2020 before the pandemic came along. It was something that we were all incredibly concerned about. And we have been very lucky, I think, that the last fire season was nowhere near as significant as the first one, especially with the pandemic raging. The idea of having super bushfires raging at the same time as the pandemic would have been a bit of a calamity. So please introduce yourself. Tell us an interesting fact as to how you got into remote sensing and the Bushfire Initiative, and what it is you're working on.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, so I'm Marta Yebra, as Catherine said, and I have a Spanish background, if you wonder where my accent comes from. And yes, I'm also very excited to be a mission specialist born in Spain. It had brought a lot of opportunities. And I guess a random factor from me, and that doesn't really answer why I came into space, is that I wanted to be a dentist when I was 18, but I failed the exam. So that's what brought me to space. But I'm very happy that happened. Yeah. So I may share my slides now. I hope you see the slides now. Yep, good. So yes, so as Catherine said, major bushfires are a concern in Australia, but also around the world. So we need to take serious actions to tackle the underlying problem that is indeed climate change, and drastically reduce our emissions. So further warming doesn't even boost further more bushfire risk. However, we need to be prepared, and we need to also accelerate the implementation of technologies as soon as possible to ensure fire and land managers can access the best possible data for more efficient prediction, prevention, and mitigation strategies before an ignition even happens. So one of the most crucial aspects of fire prevention is indeed understanding the vegetation, or what we call fuel states. So this is because the more fuel you have and the drier that fuel is, the higher your chances of bushfire if you have an ignition source. So the 2020 Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements highlighted the need for better fuel information at national scale. And Earth observation from space has an important role to play in that regard. So over the last 15 years, when I quit my idea of being a dentist, I have been using satellite data to support fire managers by, for example, helping us to identify those settings for a catastrophic bushfire event by knowing where and when there is a continuous cover of fuel that is dry enough to facilitate the ignition and the propagation of extreme bushfire behavior. So we have produced maps, as these ones that I show in the slides, with different level of detail to support different bushfire management activities. For example, well, in this map, all the red areas are areas with very dry fuel, while the dark blue areas are the opposite, very wet vegetation. And the broad scale maps that you have in the left are derived from satellite data from NASA, and are useful to give a big picture overview of the dryness of the landscape and the consequent potential bushfire risk. The other map I show in your right give you more detailed information with higher spatial resolution that help us to identify fuel moisture content gradients in the landscape. And this is important because these gradients determine differences in fire behavior. So, however, this information, although it's been very useful, it mainly comes from foreign satellites. So Australia currently mainly relying on foreign satellites to get this information, which again, even is useful. This data is not optimized for measuring our unique bushfire landscape and is highly flammable eucalypt forests. So recognizing this, about 3 years ago, I combined my expertise on bushfire remote sensing and pre-fire data analytics with a team at the Stromlo New Campus with excellent expertise in optical and infrared sensor system to develop a mission that is called OSFuel. That is an Australian microsatellite mission to monitor fuel conditions and predict bushfire-prone areas from low Earth orbit. And this is exactly what this logo in the slide represents. So we have eucalypt trees with the Australian shape because it's an Australian mission, and a small satellite orbiting around the canopy to collect that information about the fuel. So the idea of fuel mission requires a challenging combination of high ground resolution and wide field and cloud cover repeat imaging capability that will be hard to deliver with a first generation of macro small satellites. But the one recent study that we published, and you can see in this slide, and you can access with that link, is a feasibility study for OSFuel 1 to monitor Australian eucalypt forests from space every 6 to 8 days during the early hours in the afternoon. That is when the vegetation is more stressed and can be more easily ignite and spread, and about 15 meters spatial resolution that is adequate for bushfire management. So if we compare again this to existing capability I have described in my previous slide, OSFuel will not only tell us if a location is wetter or drier at a high level, but will also enable us to know when and where exactly we cross critical flammability conditions that can lead to those catastrophic bushfires. And this will be a game-changing for the fire industry in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta. I think all of us have been personally affected by bushfires in one way, shape or the other. My second son was born in November 2019, and we had poor air quality in Brisbane from the rainforest being on fire behind the Gold Coast, which would seem like it would be something that should never ever happen. Rainforests on fire. And we've seen even in the last 12 months, Siberia on fire. And so we are obviously facing in, climate change emergency, an increased frequency of these kinds of risks of catastrophic bushfires. So how does this kind of technology actually lead the rest of the world in new ways of monitoring risk, maybe to help develop solutions, but also how is it unique? Tell us more about it.
Yes, so our fuel mission is unique because, as I mentioned, it measures fuel properties that are related to fire occurrence and fire behavior, and therefore is essential for the creation of an Earth observation early warning system with high revisit, high spatial resolution and sensitivity to these fuel properties. So most early warning systems currently used around the world and fire danger indices mainly are using weather variables or drought indices as proxy of fuel moisture content and fuel loads. But OSFuel will directly measure reflectance in the specific wavelengths that are sensitive to changes in these flammability components of the forest, and therefore will provide a more direct and comprehensive characterization of flammability at a continental scale.
How do you see, I mean, we all know that we work in our specialisms, right? So we're all what we call T's or deep W's or the deep verticals that we have inside our careers and our specialist technical capabilities. But you're obviously able to see the bigger picture here from an ecosystems sort of approach, and not just from the ecosystem on the ground, the technology ecosystem that sits over this. So how do you see this particular capability integrating with other types of technology to provide a more holistic approach around extreme bushfires? Yeah,
well, OSFuel is indeed a core piece of the puzzle of the ANU Bushfire Initiative I'm the director of. So the ANU Bushfire Initiative undertakes advanced interdisciplinary research to develop an innovative and integrated national system to detect bushfires as soon as they start and extinguish those emissions within minutes. So the initiative is especially focused on lighting emissions in remote areas because we know that those cause around 90% of the damage during the Black Summer, for example. And OSFuel is an important component and piece of the puzzle to achieve that overall objective because better fuel mapping at a national scale assist to identify which lighting strikes within an individual storm that can be composed by thousands of strikes are most likely to ignite a fire. For example, when the fuel is wet, the flow of electricity to generate the heat to ignite a fire is greater than when the fuel is dry. So this identification of high-risk lightning strikes is very important to allow a faster response to ignition detection technologies that we are also developing in this bushfire initiative in collaboration and partnership with Optus.
So this obviously is Australian focused, Australian technology looking at Australian problems, but we know that catastrophic bushfires and an increased frequency of bushfires is not just an Australian issue. So what other countries do you think will be the initial people to uptake or get involved, or where do you think this technology should be applied going forwards?
Well, this technology in the longer term will benefit many different countries, and indeed, OSFuel, we are talking with the wildfire pilot project that is a project led by the Committee of Earth Observation Satellites. And this is a committee where countries collaborate to deliver satellite Earth observation systems for fire in all phases, from prediction to monitoring and post-fire assessment. And Australia, with OzFuel, will lead the work on fire prevention to deliver data that will fit into early warning systems across the world. But also it will complement other existing active fire detection missions. And to mention one, we have the Canadian Space Agency that is developing WildfireSat, again, a mission for early fire detection. But OzFuel will complement this mission with information about the fuel. Once a fire starts, you need to know how the fuel is, also to know where the fire will spread.
So, I mean, this is obviously going to be a potential game changer for large financial institutions, insurance companies, everybody where there's an economic feedback loop from this kind of bushfire. And that's before we even start talking about, you know, the trauma and the stress that the communities that are affected by these fires have, and also some of the health implications from the smoke that was generated. We still haven't, I don't think, fully seen the health implications from some of that around the extreme bushfires. But how can people get involved? How can they invest? Where is it that people, if they're watching this thinking, I really want to support this project, or I really want to get involved, what should they do?
Well, we are always open to partnering or working with other companies who wants to help this capability, and as you said, help to protect Australian and the wildlife. But also, I haven't mentioned, but this technology based on shortwave infrared detectors can also potentially be used for other non-bushfire related applications, such as defense applications, precision agriculture, and mineral explorations, to mention just some. So we are also open to working with both defense, civilian, and commercial partners. So just get in touch.
Fantastic. Okay, and on this note, we shall move on, and I'm going to share my screen again. Look at this, technology in action. Thank you for the questions that are coming in. We're going to get to them. Please, if you do have a question, pop it in to the Q&A function. Now, it's with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Philippa Ryan. I normally call you Pip, so I hope you forgive me if I accidentally call you that, Dr. Ryan. Dr. Ryan is a barrister and associate professor at the ANU College of Law. Her research focuses on the liability of third parties to a breach of trust, the automation of trust, and the accountability of algorithms. She explores how emerging technology affects us on Earth and in space. Dr. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. Please let us know a little more about yourself and maybe a random fact if you have one.
I do have a random fact. Thank you very much. And I would say I'm also interested in other domains. I think I can go submarine, on the ocean, on the land, and then up into space. Random fact, completely unrelated to anything else. I am a barrister, so I'm a trial lawyer. I was appearing in court once before a very scary judge in the equity division. I was before the Chief Justice, and he said in the middle of my submissions, Ms. Ryan, you're starting to make sense. I'm going to have to adjourn. And that was probably the high point of my career. So yeah, I'm very happy. My students, my law students, just love the fact that I got a good shellacking on a regular basis from the bench, and I usually deserved it. So when we think about the work that I'm doing in relation to autonomy, and particularly trust systems in autonomy, it does tie in with just a little piece I wanted to add to my introduction, which is that over the last 4 years, I've been very closely working as a member of the International Standards Organization and Standards Australia on the standards for blockchain-based smart contracts. And it's actually in the context of that I can then segue into my slides, because at about, I think it must have been about the middle of 2018, we were getting to the point where we were starting to present our work on what smart contracts would look like. And I had created an autonomy matrix that basically said, depending on where you're going to use your smart contract, you need to think about how automated it should be. And I would argue that this is the same for space vehicles. And we're talking here about the interaction of physical systems in outer space in the same way that we need to think about virtual systems in cyberspace. And when we think about autonomy and making things autonomous, my argument is that we need to think about levels of autonomy and then how that might impact on, say, ascribing liability. So let's go to my slides, because this can really sheet home when we think about things like vehicles. And I did have to actually really confront this, because at one point, the International Standards Organization's Technical Management Board in Geneva got in touch with me via our secretariat and said, Dr. Ryan is going to have to explain why she wants to talk about legal systems within this standard for smart contracts. We don't allow that. And I said to the Technical Management Board, as a lawyer, I can assure you, wherever humans roam, there will be legal systems. The law will find a way, and we need to address that. So what I did to improve the work that I was doing was found an analogous set of standards that already existed, which also suggested different levels of autonomy in order to manage liability. And what I went to was cars. So I have done a really close analysis of the way that autonomous systems work with cars. So I mean motor cars, motor vehicles. And then I've also looked at this in relation to algorithms, smart contracts, and weapons, killer robots. So let's just focus on cars for the purposes of today's presentation, because then I can just take us straight up into outer space. And basically back in 2015, this is just over 6 years ago, Volvo said that it was going to accept liability for its self-driving cars. It was so confident that these vehicles' sensors would prevent an autonomous mode. So you've set the car into an autonomous or semi-autonomous mode. It was so sure that its sensors would prevent impact with moving or fixed obstructions, that it was saying, we'll accept liability if anything happens. Well, let's cast our minds forward to an incident in March 2018, just 2.5 years later. A vehicle, the same Volvo that was shown in the picture with Forbes magazine reporting that Volvo was willing to accept liability. The same vehicle is the subject of testing in Tempe, Arizona, and a woman cyclist is killed by that car. The car hits her. Now, there was a backup operator sitting inside the vehicle that she was known as the backup driver. The driver is the autonomous system that's being tested by Uber. The Volvo has a human sitting inside in the driver's seat, and she was known as the backup operator. And the idea was, if the Volvo sensor systems fail to detect that there's an obstruction coming that could either damage the vehicle or kill the human, if indeed it's a human, as was the case on this occasion, if the systems don't stop, you've got the backup driver just applies their foot to the brake and the vehicle comes to a stop in time. Problem was, human was watching an episode of the TV show The Voice on her iPhone or iPad while she's sitting in the driver's seat. So she's got her eyes off the road. So she was in a position where, had she been watching, she probably would have prevented it. So what does Volvo say? Does Volvo say, oh, and even in this case, we'll accept liability? Well, no, they said we don't. We disclaim any liability in this case because we felt that where there's a backup driver, they should be responsible under the testing conditions. They shifted the liability to Uber. Uber shifted the liability to the backup driver, and she was charged with negligent homicide. So that's a very interesting conspectus for us, because this really sets us thinking, well, who decides who's liable? Now, I can tell you right from the get-go, as a litigator, the person who's going to be the most attractive liable party will be the one with the money. So you would go for either Uber or you would go for Volvo if what you want is money. And that's what litigators are interested in. Now, the courts will say, well, this is a case of negligent homicide. We'll deal with it as a crime. Charging someone with a crime is hopeless. You'll never get any money. What you want is to sue them. And you would sue Uber or you would sue Volvo if you're after that money. Volvo can't offer to be liable. It can accept liability and then do a deal. But if somebody wants to step up and say, we'll go for Uber instead, that's a matter for the way that case runs. So why does this matter in space? Well, the reason it matters, well, let's ask Sandra. Sandra would tell us that the reason why it matters in space is because there's a whole lot of space junk floating around in the LEO. This is a low Earth orbit. So I know we've got a lot of experts who've dialed into this, but just for the sake of completeness, there's a whole lot of stuff circling around the sun, including us, Earth. And then there's stuff circling around Earth, including the moon. But in the low Earth orbit, there's a lot of stuff circling around that Marta and Francis use for their lasers and detecting fuel on the ground. And while all of that is circling around, it's causing a problem which could lead to a thing called the Kessler syndrome. Look it up, very interesting theory that has actually now collided with Elon Musk's Starlink, which Catherine mentioned in her opening. And basically, Elon wants to put more and more stuff up into space to aid with the kind of satellite-based NBN or Wi-Fi service that Francis dreamed of when he was in his teens on the farm. That's what Elon wants to do. And when people say to Elon, yeah, but what are you going to do when it all smashes into each other and then it smashes into other systems and then we don't have GPS anymore? And he says, I'll clean it up. I'm going to be the cleanup crew. His cleanup thesis is very childish, really. It just have a look at Moonraker, or you never live, what is it, you only die twice, or whatever the James Bond movie is with the big open extractor, or the nets or the magnets. Hopeless. So the parting shot from me is this. From my perspective as a lawyer who's very interested in autonomous systems, I would say the first question is, what is the world of interest or the operational domain of your autonomous system? The second step is, how autonomous should you allow it to be in those domains without a human with their foot ready to hit the pedal and hopefully eyes on the road? And I think these questions are going to become very important as we see a greater interest in commercialization of either space, I guess you'd call it space capability or space-based engineering, but also tourism, space tourism. So that's it. That's from Pip the litigator, but also somebody who's very interested in autonomous systems and the liability of either operators or third parties.
Pip, it's really interesting about that cascade of authority and responsibility, which obviously still isn't set in stone. And will I suggest be, well, maybe you could answer this, is it correct to suggest that this is actually going to be based in case law rather than, someone coming out with the kind of standard? And did that woman get found guilty of negligent homicide, or was she acquitted?
I don't know the outcome of what happened to her, I've got to say. That might have something to do with short notice presentation.
Sorry, put you on the spot there.
No, putting me on the spot is good, because that's a great question, and I'll look up what happened to her and make sure I'm ready for that question in future. So in relation to the way that litigation works and the way you can identify who's liable, you do start with the regulation. But it's an interesting thing because, for example, if you say, if an operator of one of Marta's systems to extinguish bushfire has liability sheeted to the pilot, to the operator, it's very likely that the operator will have insurance that says, well, my insurer will indemnify me if what goes wrong falls within what the insurer is willing to cover. But it could also be that there is another insurance framework, because you can't expect a pilot, an individual, to be able to indemnify everybody, where in fact there may be autonomous systems where you need to make sure that the operator or designer of the autonomous system is liable for that piece. And so what happens in reality is, no matter how much you try to put into contract or into legislation, in the end, the law will find its way to identify who's got the money and to try and get them to pay. And so what you do, and you look to insurers, you look to designers, and you look for fault that will sheet home liability in a way that's meaningful if what you're trying to do is sue someone. Criminal liability, very different, very much set down in the regulation. That's your first port of call, because that's how our system works in Australia.
I'm just going to jump into one of the questions that's come in rather than go through the ones that I've got here, because there's a geopolitical question here. Is liability in space affected by where the jurisdiction from where it came from, or is there a common law applicability in space? What is the geopolitical situation like in low Earth orbit?
Okay, so my understanding from speaking to people who know a lot about the law of the sea is that there are analogous systems for registration of ships at sea. You would go to registration of aeroplanes and those existing and analogous systems, and then by extension just say, well, where is the spaceship registered? And the registration of spaceship systems, either in commercial or government or defence, is going to be something that is more and more regulated. There are treaties around this. That exists. There are treaties that say if you're going to send things into space, you need to have a registration system for that, and you need to register it in the same way that we do for ships and aeroplanes and cars. And then it becomes the registered owner. And then the jurisdiction is determined based on, you can have a fight over conflict of laws and where that should occur, but usually that determines jurisdiction.
When do you suggest we might start seeing some of this testing of that kind of law and process? When are we going to start seeing serious impact from space junk on sovereign-owned capability?
My colleagues on this panel might have a different view, but I would say sooner than we would have thought 10 years ago. And I think one of the things that's been very surprising in 2021 is the explosion and popularity of space tourism in a way that I think we hadn't predicted. I think we knew it was going to happen, but I don't think we thought that it would happen by 2021 and so successfully and with such a strong appetite to take up that offering. So sooner rather than later.
Yeah, working with the X Prize, one of the first things they talk about is the very first Ansari X Prize, which was, of course, in 2002 that started the commercial space industry. So if you think about it, that's nearly 20 years old. So it's been a couple of decades coming, but you're right, we've reached this almost mushroom cloud level of interest in space tourism, with billionaires liking to compare their spacecraft to each other. But should we, on a serious note, should we actually be worried about this automation of trust? What is it going to mean for us, the general public? What are the threats to our lives and our way of life around how some of these, trust-based systems are going to be put into play?
I think we're getting better at it. So the designers are getting better at the idea that you need to test. There's a lot of people who say trust but verify. I think it's trust and verify. I don't think those two are mutually exclusive or stepped. I think they have to happen at the same time. I would argue, because I'm an optimist and a nerd, I am square. I would argue that we can harness sophisticated technologies to manage how we trust those systems. And so it's always going to be the humans we trust, the humans we don't trust, but the autonomous systems, I think, plug gaps. As somebody who studied a lot of fraud, I think we can plug fraud, we can eliminate corruption, we can make sure people pay their taxes, we can do a lot more data matching, and we can also ensure that there's fewer mistakes by using sophisticated tracking technologies, and those tracking technologies can shore up trust in those technologies. And I think all of that looks better than ever before. Humans, and the history books and the law books are full of this, the litigiousness of English men and women has been fueled by fraud and untrustworthy behavior of humans. It's not just the technology. So I'm an optimist that there's good places for us to go with that.
So, I mean, someone might be watching this and thinking, gosh, I hadn't even thought about any of this before. I want to get involved. How can I get involved in good governance, both on Earth and in space, when looking at this, new frontier that we're going to have, this new economy, this space economy that we're going to have both in Australia and globally?
The first thing I would do is get educated and do it formally, not informally. Do something like our graduate certificate in new technologies law here at ANU. There's a great plug. I think the benefit of getting a great formal education and then going to tutorials or going to meetups is you arm yourself with the right terminology. You arm yourself with the lexicon of that whole new area of interest that you have, and you meet other people, like-minded, smart, well-educated, who want to be better informed. That's, for me, that is the entree to great opportunities and to even pivoting your own career towards those things that you're interested in.
Just going to open mic it now between our three panelists. We've got a couple of questions come in. One here. Let's talk about all of the things we've just discussed here. What sort of applications? I mean, they're particularly asking here, Francis, about quantum encryption. But what applications from the defence or even the sovereign manufacturer or sovereign capability do we have around the technologies that you've talked about? And probably start with you, Francis, then go to you, Marta, and then back to you, Pip.
Sure. So in terms of the defence sector, there are huge applications for quantum encryption and quantum communications. Some of the most advanced demonstrations to date have come out of China. They've put a huge amount of money into developing a specific satellite to demonstrate some of this technology. They've demonstrated some quantum encryption techniques between Austria and China, so very long distance. The issues with those demonstrations are that they are very low bandwidth, less than 1 bit per second. So you can't really get a workable system out of that for defence. There are other ways you can do it. ANU has some of the leading technology to allow you to do very high data rate quantum communication and encryption, and also some techniques and technology to be able to enable quantum networks around the world. Some of the things, Pip, that you were talking about, like trust systems, every time you transmit your data somewhere, it's going to go through multiple nodes. So you have to trust every one of those nodes. You can actually, with quantum communication, have modes of communication where you don't have to have any trust of any node carrying that information. Because if that node did actually intercept and process that information itself, it would destroy the quantum state, which is carrying whatever information you were transmitting. So they wouldn't get the information and it would never arrive. You would know that it's been tampered with. So you can have untrusted nodes in your communication network. For defence specifically, there are technological hurdles that you still need to clear to be able to make it a reality. There are, I guess, a number of options for the defence sector in terms of how they do their encryption. And I think it's still a work in progress as to how this could be enabled, particularly for a country like Australia. There are some really good opportunities to develop the technology that we have already started here. There are opportunities to partner with some really good neighbours around the region and around the world to be able to enable our defence for the future. I think it's something we can't be left behind in, and we will have to develop. And it'll be interesting to see, I guess, which way defence here in Australia decides to go in the end. It's important, I think, for the Australian research community to, be part of that conversation to help describe and in detail what we think is likely to come out of the research that we're doing and where we think our money should be invested to advance the technology to allow us to have that edge.
Fantastic. Marta, what are your thoughts around national sovereign capability and defence opportunities with your work?
Well, first of all, there is a direct application. So defense, of course, the Defense Department carry out operations that have a risk of ignition. And we have had some instances, for example, in 2013, some fires around Sydney were ignited by some operations from defense. So I have had a few projects with the Defense Department to provide information about the fuel and to let them know when and where it's safe to carry on those training activities, so there is no risk of ignition. So that's a very direct application where OSFuel can also contribute. But other than that, I don't know a lot about what other kind of applications could be. But for example, a shockwave infrared could be useful for identifying potential shadow buried unexploded devices that again can be detected with this kind of wavelengths. Yeah.
Fantastic. Pip, you're on mute, mate. Get the t-shirt.
Sorry, I do need that, don't I? Thank you. I think one of the interesting things for Australia and for our position in the region is that we generally, when we convene with other countries in a global forum, we are regarded as a trustworthy country. So when we're developing technologies or creating alliances with other countries, we shore up their reputation as well. For me, as we develop new technologies, that's the key. For me, that's it. We've got to develop a sovereignty of a trustworthiness.
So we're coming into maybe 1 minute left. Look at that, it was perfectly timed. Not like I've done this before. Okay, so if anyone does have a burning question, I'm going to give you like literally 10 seconds to fire that through to the Q&A. Otherwise, what I might ask our wonderful panelists to do, and we'll probably do this the same way we have. We'll go Francis, Marta, and then Pip. Just maybe your hopes and desires for the research that you're working on for the next 5 to 10 years. If we were to have this conversation again in 10 years' time, what's going to be some of the major achievements that you'd have liked to have got through in that time? Francis.
So I think Australia can be part of some really large exploration in terms of deep space communications. We have a really broad cloud-free continent. We have some really world-leading technology in terms of quantum communication that we need some more investment, more to be able to build that up and have that be applied to a range of sectors. And I think we can also be a hub for global optical communications, because everyone wants to come and put their telescopes in the desert here and be able to actually talk to them, because Europe and Singapore are always cloudy.
That tropical convergence zone and its pesky cloud gives us massive opportunities. Marta.
I guess OSFuel is, how I see OSFuel is like a pathfinder for a more ambitious, fully operational hyperspectral imaging satellite that will be serving for more broader environmental monitoring activities. And yes, so the objective would be also to try to give back to other countries everything that we have been taking and receiving over the last years, just depending on those satellite capabilities that are coming from overseas as well. So, for example, Australia has been relying in overseas programs like the NASA USGS Landsat or the European Space Agency Sentinel-2, and all these programs have been providing critical data sets to Australia for many years. But the idea would be that we can contribute with Australian capability to those programs with, for example, a satellite cross-calibration radiometer. And this is a study that recently Geoscience Australia published with the University of New South Wales. And basically, the idea is to have an hyperspectral imaging spectrometer that will be launched into orbit to provide coincident imagery opportunities with all these calibrated Earth observation missions that are coming from overseas, and will give a highly accurate and stable cross calibration data that can also be used for those satellite missions. So it's also to give back a bit to other countries in many aspects.
Can I just say, Marta, I'm very glad you didn't go into dentistry. I'm very glad that you're doing this work, and I'll let you know, I missed medical school by 0.3% on my chemistry qualification. So I'm with you on that one. It's like, maybe not there. Let's go down this other path. So I'm very grateful that you're not checking people's teeth and that you're working on this project.
Me too.
Pip, you get the final word, mate.
Oh, that's so good. Thank you, Catherine. I would add only to what they said that in 2031, I would like to look back on basically the 100 years up to 2021 as a strange era of fossil fuel powered cars that led to a horrific road toll each year in Australia, and that Australia has led the way towards greener and safer transport systems.
Spot on. Okay, well, I think in summarising from today, you can see that here at the ANU's In Space, we have a broad but deep knowledge of interconnected opportunities around not only how space is going to provide us lots of opportunities for good things, but also where there's going to be, as Shakespeare would say, the rub might lie. And I do find it interesting where the rub lies, because that's where you can find those frictions between elements of an ecosystem that provide massive opportunities for leadership and massive opportunities for change. And I think that Australia can be a guiding light in many of these regards, not only because of the people that we have, but also because of the way in which our country actually sits itself on our beautiful blue marble. Jessica, are you there to provide the closing slides, please?
Thank you for attending, everybody. Really appreciate your time today. The session has been recorded and it will be available on the City website. And our next session coming up is next week on Wednesday at 10 a.m. It's the future of work, your role in the space sector. So I'll be moderating that session, which will be very exciting. We've got James Ewan, who's the Director of Space at Western Australian Government Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation. We've got Renee Sayers, who's the Deputy Director for Space Science and Technology Centre at Curtin University, Rob Creamer, who's the Director of Connectors Australia, and Vidushi Badakara, who's the CEO at Astro Hub. So hopefully get a chance to catch that one. And thanks again for attending, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
See you. Bye.
Bye.